They say empires crumble from within, that a single act of passion can undo years of bloodshed, strategy, and sacrifice. But in the twilight of the Third Crusade, something far more dangerous than swords or siege towers took root in the heart of the Holy Land. It began not on the battlefield, but behind the silken curtains of a candlelit chamber. This is the forbidden tale few historians dare to explore. A love so perilous, it threatened to unravel the very fabric of Christendom's sacred mission. This is the story of the romance that ended a crusade. By the year 1191, the Third Crusade was bleeding. Led by mighty kings, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the reluctant Holy Roman Emperor, they had come to reclaim Jerusalem, pried from Christian hands just 4 years earlier by the legendary Muslim commander Saladin. The land burned with vengeance. Every stone held a memory of slaughter. Every prayer was laced with vengeance. But behind the religious fever, beneath the roar of battle, men were still men, and hearts were still weak. Richard had landed in the Holy Land like a thunderclap, victorious at Acre, brutal in his discipline, a soldier king feared by all. He was adored by his men and respected, even by his enemies. But his mission was not just divine. It was political. A successful crusade meant glory, leverage, and legacy. Failure would mean shame, disgrace, and perhaps civil war at home. Yet even the Lionheart, with all his focus and fire, would find himself ensnared in a web of desire and deception that no blade could cut through. The tale begins in the shadows of Acre, as the city fell to the Crusaders. Among the prisoners were nobles, diplomats, and a few mysterious figures of high rank from the Muslim world. Some taken, some surrendered. Among them was a woman unlike any the Crusaders had seen. Known only by her Arabic name, Layla, she was said to be the niece, or perhaps daughter of Saladin himself. Her eyes, they whispered, could silence generals. Her presence in the court of the Crusaders was not as a mere hostage, but as a bargaining chip. Or so they thought. Richard, it is said, first laid eyes on her in a tent outside the ruins of Acre, and something shifted. She was veiled, proud, and defiant. She refused to speak to the men who mocked her, who stared at her like an object. But when she looked at Richard, there was something different in her gaze. Not fear, not hatred, something more dangerous, curiosity. No chronicler dared to describe what happened in full. The official records are dry, sterile, filled with lists of sieges and skirmishes. But behind those cold words, rumors grew like weeds. Whispers that the Lionheart had begun to spend long hours away from his war council, that gifts were exchanged in secret, that the English king was seen walking at night near the tents of the hostages. And then the whisper that shook the entire Crusader camp. Richard and the Muslim woman were lovers. It was unthinkable. A king of Christendom entangled with the blood of his sworn enemy? If true, it would not just be scandal, it would be betrayal. And yet no punishment came. No denials were issued. Instead, something stranger happened. The siege of Jerusalem was delayed. Again and again. Richard, the fearless commander, began hesitating. His generals urged him onward. Jerusalem was vulnerable. The time was ripe, but the Lionheart faltered. He wrote letters home about his weariness, about the futility of war, about peace. Peace, that word, once sacred, now stung like poison. The Crusaders had not crossed oceans and buried friends for peace. They came for salvation, for conquest. But Richard had changed. By 1192, negotiations began between Richard and Saladin. Truces were discussed, pilgrimage rights, shared control, but each offer grew more generous, more compromising. To many, it seemed Richard no longer cared to win. Some historians argue that Richard saw the hopelessness of the war, that he was pragmatic, exhausted. Others suggest something deeper, that Layla, the woman behind the veil, had reached into the soul of the Lionheart and planted a seed of doubt, that her love or her influence had dulled the edge of his crusading zeal. Or perhaps she had shown him another truth, that the Holy Land was already soaked in too much blood. Not all accepted this. The French were outraged. Philip had already returned home in a fury, and his envoys accused Richard of weakness, of heresy. German knights spoke in riddles of the lion whose heart was chained. Even within his own camp, his officers whispered. Some demanded the execution of the woman. Others vanished. Then, in the final insult to zealots on both sides, Richard and Salah ad-Din reached an accord. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christians would be allowed to visit the holy sites unharmed. The crusade was over, not with a cross planted in victory, but with a compromise sealed in silence. Richard prepared to leave the Holy Land. Layla, too, disappeared from the records. Some claim she returned to Salah ad-Din's court. Others say she sailed west, hidden on a ship bound for Sicily under the protection of the English crown. The truth? We will never know. What we do know is this: Richard never returned to Jerusalem. He would die years later in France, pierced by a crossbow bolt, his body buried far from the city he had sworn to liberate. But in his heart, perhaps, still lingered the scent of jasmine, and the memory of a voice that spoke in a language his enemies used, but which, for a moment, had made him forget they were enemies at all. Some say the crusade was lost because of politics, others because of logistics, but perhaps it ended because of something far older than kingdoms or creeds, a force stronger than swords, more contagious than hatred, a forbidden love that dared to bloom amid the ashes of war, and perhaps that, more than anything else, terrified them all.